And it's a pleasure to see all of you, or some of you anyway, and a pleasure also to be here amidst my colleagues. When I say here, of course, ever since the middle of March, we have to put a big asterisk behind me. You can see a virtual West 86th Street. And thinking about our home there, I also want to take this moment to acknowledge that the Bard Graduate Center on West 86th Street on the island of Mannahatta sits upon the ancestral homelands of the Lenni Lenape people, and that this island and the 5 boroughs that comprise New York City are the homeland still for indigenous peoples from all over the world, and also has been a home for people forcibly brought to these shores. None of you are forcibly brought to this open house tonight. And that's important because you're here to find out more about the Bard Graduate Center. And we are very happy to have you and to talk about it. The BGC was founded in 1993, so it's a relatively young institution, though I've been around doing this since 2006, and it's gotten to be an older institution over these many years. Older a little bit, much wiser, but at its core, unchanged. And the core mission of the institution is to understand the world that humans have built through the things they have used to build it and the things they have built, both the large scale and the small, the insides of the shelters they have made for themselves, the shelters themselves, the world in which the shelters live, and the larger scale structures in which human society has unfolded. And the grand challenge of understanding the human past through things is one that must be tackled through many different approaches and many different avenues. There is no master science for something as complicated as understanding the human world. And so the Bard Graduate Center was built with the understanding and the implication of a fully committed interdisciplinarity. And our faculty, just looking at those you'll be hearing from tonight, historians, art historians, philosophers, material science, archaeology. So the experience of a student at the Bard Graduate Center is going, let's say you were taking a course from the 5 of us here. You would go not just from a course on the ancient world to one on the medieval world, let's say, but you go from the perspective on the past of an archaeologist to the perspective on the past of an art historian, to the perspective on the past of a philosopher and historian, and to that of a material scientist. That means that coming here gives you the opportunity not just to study a time and a place, and not just to study a time and a place through a particular disciplinary lens, as might be the case at another institution that you might be looking at right now, but you're going to acquire a knowledge of a time and a place, but as seen through many different kinds of lenses. And that means that wherever you go to after your experience at the BGC, you will be enriched by these experiences. Your quiver, so to speak, will have many different arrows. Your toolkit, if we want to stay with metaphors, will have many different tools. And we know, and you probably know as well, from the reading of scholarship, that often scholars have only one tool in their toolkit. And that means that the kind of scholarship they do is fundamentally dull, because if you only have a hammer, everything is a nail. But in anything as complicated as human experience, there's more than just nails, and so one needs more than just a hammer. So that's the kind of place we are. Another thing about the Bard Graduate Center that's very important is that we mix together here classroom instruction, or let's say instruction more generally, because not all of our instruction happens in the classroom. And I urge you to explore the tab in our website navigation devoted to teaching beyond the classroom. But teaching happens here alongside of research. There's no formal but artificial pardon me, division between pedagogy and research, whether it's your research or faculty research. These are fully integrated in our curriculum, which involves seminars. All of our courses, except for the initial survey courses, are research seminars. They allow faculty to develop ideas, which they then may explore in their own research. It also means that faculty research can be brought to you in the classroom around the seminar table so that you are constantly exposed, not just to new thinking, but to the excitement of new thinking and to the passion of our faculty to discover and to explore. And to research and teaching at the Bard Graduate Center, we add also exhibiting. Our own particular way of developing research projects is often through exhibitions. And these are projects that unfold over many years and that we design so that students can be involved at every different stage of the process, from faculty conceiving of their projects along with students around the seminar table, to actually developing the content with students, to moving through the design process with students, and then often teaching a course built around the exhibition once it is in the galleries and installed. There's publication in print and online that accompanies all of our exhibitions, and students are brought into the publishing process from an early stage. And through our digital media lab, there are a number of different kinds of digital projects that are associated with and integral to the various exhibitions that we design, so that students not only gain the traditional and classical tools for doing research, but also the most modern and up-to-date ways of asking questions and presenting them to a wider public. We're also an institution that is serious but informal, constantly alert to change and open to change. Many institutions either see change as an enemy or simply are unable to change. That's not the case here. And so just to take the situation that we are in, doing this open house on Zoom, the transition that we have been forced to take has been one that has moved amazingly seamlessly and has also opened up new opportunities, not only to offer ourselves and our conversation to people around the world and in many different time zones, but also to think about the opportunity to draw closer to our students as well. And so this year, on very short notice, we invented and deployed a new required encounter, a first-year tutorial where faculty meet with their advisees, first-year MA students, so that in the midst of dispersion and remote education, there's the core experience of faculty talking to students about ideas is one that we preserve and enshrine at the heart of our curriculum. Ultimately, we are a small institution that does many, many different things. The smallness of the institution means that alongside of the grand language I've used to talk about the adventure of learning, the seriousness of our approach to research, the elaborateness of our education, the ability of the institution to change and adapt to new circumstances, at the core of that experience is a personal relationship, is, one might even say, an empathetic core of the institution. All of us, faculty, staff, and students who are here, are engaged in a common project to understand the world through things. Each of us does it in our own way. Each of us asks the questions that are important to us to ask. But that sense of common engagement in a question is something that connects all of us, and it gives the institution a resilience and a strength which enables it to carry on through times of stress, but also in the best of times to feel that the institutional endeavor is something that is shared. It's not something that any of you or any of us goes through alone. And that's something important to consider when thinking about graduate education, which is, after all, a stressful thing to do under any circumstances, and especially at a time like this. So with that, I'll wrap up my introductory words. You've come here really to hear my colleagues, and to be honest, I have too. So it's with great pleasure that I'll begin the process that you're here for and ask Ivan Gaskell to speak. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And the first thing I'd like to say is that this is not something one can take for granted, but we all get on with each other extremely well. And I think that helps to create an atmosphere in which everyone can thrive. And I've been at Bard Graduate Center now for 8 years, and I find it a place that is highly congenial. In fact, the most congenial place I've worked in academia since my first job at the Warburg Institute, which was more years ago than I care to remember. What we're going to do is each of us is going to show you a real thing and talk a little bit about it. So the real thing that I'm going to show you, I happen to be at home in Lexington, Massachusetts. So actually, before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the ancestral lands of the Massachusetts and Nipmuc peoples. The thing I want to show you is a designed and mass manufactured object. I'm sure you can all recognize what it is. And I can't see you all, I can just see a couple of you at the top of the screen, so I can't really ask you, what do you think it is? But I think you'll all recognize this as a cocktail shaker. And it's a cocktail shaker from Europe, from the 1930s. It has something on it, and you might just be able to make this out. It is a cockerel on top of a cocktail shaker. On the lid, which I'll take off, it has an inscription, which it's reversed on my screen, but it says, "Dan's cocktails are just right." And I'm sure they are. This comes apart. And as you know, you put the booze in there with ice. You close it up. You wrap it in a cloth because it gets really cold when you shake it. Now, what is the culture of such a thing? What is the culture that surrounds such a thing, that gives rise to and then surrounds such a thing? I'm going to share my screen now and show you some slides. And I hope you can see this. Here you see some photographs that allow you to see those inscriptions and see it more clearly. So the culture of the cocktail. What happens in 1933? The 21st Amendment. I'm talking about what happens in 1933 in the United States. The 21st Amendment repealing the 18th Amendment, prohibition. So from 1933, drink is out of the closet and the cocktail culture takes off. And I want to show how that happens in popular culture, if one can call it popular culture, with a movie from the following year, The Thin Man, the first of a series of movies with William Powell and Myrna Loy, in which our detectives basically move from martini to martini. And the presence of cocktails in this movie is inescapable. And I just want to show you a very brief, it's gone, clip from this movie. Come on. I had this loaded. And it's...
The important thing is the rhythm. Always have rhythm in your shaking. Now, in Manhattan, you shake to foxtrot time. A Bronx to two-step time. The dry martini, you always shake to waltz time.
So always shake your martini to waltz time. And that's good advice. Let me get back to the slides. But I want to move forward 11 years to 1945, the winter of 1945, because even though this is a manufactured object, it's far from unique. Each one of these things has a life, and the life of each of these things is different from the life of every other one. And this one has a particular life, which I can tell you about. So this is something that you won't get from inspecting it, but it's something that adheres to it so long as its past is remembered. Its past is remembered. I remember its past because my mother, from whom I inherited it, told me about it. So this cocktail shaker has a particular past, and it goes back to the liberation of the Netherlands at the end of the Second World War in May 1945. You can see on this liberation map, as it's titled here, Bevrijdingskaart, that at the time of the signing of the surrender, the Germans were still in control of this area, the Frisian Islands, the provinces of North and South Holland, and most of Utrecht. And this part had been taken with heavy fighting by the 1st Canadian Army. And the surrender was signed on May 5th in a hotel called De Wereld in Wageningen, in the east of the Netherlands. Now, my mother and her parents lived in a town called Wassenaar, which is very near The Hague, during this time. And they lived through the occupation. And my mother kept a diary. She kept that diary for her elder brother, who was a naval officer who had escaped from the Netherlands and then been posted to the Dutch East Indies, what's now Indonesia, captured by the Japanese and held on the notorious Burma Railroad. So my mother and her parents, my grandparents, lived in Wassenaar, a wooded suburb of The Hague, which was the headquarters of the German occupation forces. And my family's house was turned into an officer's billet. And during the final winter of the war, that's known as the Hunger Winter, my mother was the only member of the family who was physically capable of scavenging food. My uncle, her younger brother, was in hiding to avoid forced labor conscription in Germany. And my mother traveled the countryside on a bicycle with wooden tires because all rubber had been confiscated, and gathered food during that terrible winter when many thousands of Dutch people died of starvation. And for a time they subsisted on tulip bulbs. And while cycling from one place to another to gather food, she also delivered messages from one resistance group to another. And this in turn led her to playing a particular role during the liberation. On May 8th, 3 days after the German surrender in the Netherlands, she records in that diary the arrival of troops from the Canadian First Army in nearby Leiden. She rode with them from Leiden to her hometown of Wassenaar, where a tank detachment was sent to secure the German headquarters buildings. And she was the one who took responsibility of riding on the lead tank to guide the tank troop to the right places. And we see here a photograph not of my mother, but of a resistance member here showing a Canadian Army officer on a map where the way he should be going. So he's wearing this armband of a Potvinder Holland, which I won't go into what that all means, but I could make that out. So he's a resistance member. And this is what my mother did. And this is how she met a young Canadian tank commander whose name, all I know, is Lieutenant, Canadian, so Lieutenant Monaghan, who clearly took a shine to her because he gave her the cocktail shaker. That's how she got this cocktail shaker, from the tank troop commander who took a shine to my mother during these tumultuous times. Now, why a tank commander in the field should have a cocktail shaker in his kit is beyond me, but that's what my mother told me, and I have no reason to doubt it. And there she is. So that's my story of the cocktail shaker. As I say, it's something that adheres to it, but cannot be told from inspecting it. That's the same. There's a story with every single thing that you might care to look at and research. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Professor Jennifer Mass.
Thank you. Is it possible? Oh, there I am. Great. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to at least virtually meet all of you. I want to tell you a little bit about my background in chemistry and art, about the courses that I teach, and then we're going to look at an object just like Ivan has showed you. So I first met an art historian when I was 5 years old, and my mother hired a babysitter who was an art historian, which meant that in the town that I grew up in, she was employed as the mortician's assistant, putting makeup onto the corpses. And so every day, Crystal would come to my house and say, today we are going to learn to paint in the matter of Jean Miro. And she would show us all of her art history books, whether it was Miro or Cézanne. She really liked the early modernists and taught us how to be painters and taught us how to be art historians. And so the message that my sisters and I got from all of this work was that we were incredibly passionate about art. And the message that my parents got was that if you're an art historian, then you can get a job as a mortician's assistant. So when it came time for me to go to college, I remember sitting down and telling my parents, I have this incredible passion for chemistry and this incredible passion for art, and I really don't know what to major in. And they said, Jennifer, that's fantastic. You can major in chemistry. So I became a chemistry major and ultimately went on to get my PhD in chemistry and materials engineering while still retaining this passion for art and material culture. And I don't know how well you can see this. I'm wearing a necklace with a peridot gemstone in the center and peridot earrings too. That was my job in graduate school, to make synthetic peridot gemstones, because just like rubies and sapphires are used as energy sources basically in lasers, peridots are as well in basically, they're used as optical amplifiers in tunable solid state lasers in the near infrared, which was extremely important for the huge amount of fiber optic communication systems that were being built in the 90s. So that was my background. But while I was studying these fabulous gemstones using a gamma ray spectroscopy technique called neutron activation analysis, I started meeting archaeologists around the nuclear reactor, and they were doing gamma ray spectroscopy on tiny fragments of potsherds. And I was so fascinated by these archaeologists who were studying material culture using the same technique that I was using for these very high-tech applications, and thought, this is it. This is the way that I can combine chemistry and art by going into the field of art conservation as a cultural heritage scientist. So I went on from my PhD to do my postdoctoral research at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where they were doing the reinstallation of the Greek and Roman galleries. And so had the wonderful opportunity to do this incredibly deep dive into the materials and technologies of the ancient Greeks and Romans. I then followed with this with about 20 years of teaching analytical chemistry and inorganic chemistry as it relates to works of art at the Art Conservation Master's Degree programs in Buffalo and Delaware, two of the three art conservation programs in the United States. And now that I'm in New York City, I also do some teaching for NYU. So I've now taught at all of the art conservation programs in the US. And so that put me in a really wonderful place to come to Bard Graduate Center and to really expand my teaching and look at how the molecular nature of cultural heritage objects can inform us about important aspects of an object of art, not just the chemistry of degradation, which was my previous focus, but also understanding, for example, a class that I taught last year was on the chemistry behind patina. And we often think about patina occurring on alloys and folk art and paintings, but actually there's patina that occurs on furniture, that occurs on glasses, on all different types of cultural objects, and relating people's attitudes towards patina to their social status. And so really taking this elemental, molecular, and microscopic information that I can get from an object of cultural heritage and relating that to some of the broader humanities questions. Another class that I've really had so much fun teaching at the BGC is looking at how we can break up the Industrial Revolution into really two different industrial revolutions. There was a revolution in inorganic chemistry and a revolution in organic chemistry. So from the perspective of works of art, we can think of that as a tremendous number of new pigments and dyes that were introduced in the 19th century, but also new alloys for artists to work with as well, such as German silver, which is actually an alloy of copper and nickel and zinc, and then also new synthetic polymers like cellulose nitrate and cellulose acetate, and learn all about all of the ways that artists could change their modes of expression based upon all those new materials, but also all of the ways that those new materials that artists really jumped to embrace, unfortunately, were chemically unstable and have led to us just over 120 years later, understanding a lot of the changes that have gone on with works of art made from the 1880s, say, up to the beginning of World War II, up to the 1930s. And so that kind of gives you a sense of how I bring chemistry into the classroom. But then also some of the other things that have come up with all of these new artist materials that were invented in the 19th century is they tended to be made out of materials like arsenic and chromium and cadmium. And so we've learned now that basically the environmental, this wasn't just a revolution in terms of chemistry, but this was also a revolution in terms of environmental justice. And it's hard to really imagine the environmental justice movement today without looking back to its origins in the 19th century. And so that's something that I love to think about. And of course, something else that was invented in the 19th century was photography, which of course was an entirely new medium in which artists could tell their stories. But also, if you think about the work of Jacob Riis and Joseph Heim, it's impossible for the social justice movements to have begun in the 19th century without the introduction of photography. And so we see technology and environmental justice and technology and social justice really all going hand in hand in the 19th century. And now we can really relate that so much to what's happening in the 21st century. And for example, looking at the proliferation of microplastics in the environment. And so I find myself drawn again and again to the 19th century because there's so much that informs us about what's important to us today. So I'm going to share my screen now to show a particular object that I've been focusing on and give you a sense of some of my research interests. Okay, so what we're looking at here is Meiji or an Edo era Urushi Lacquer Jubako. And your first quiz for the night, does anybody know what Jubako is? Think about Japanese food and how it's served. Okay, I don't want to put you on the spot, so I'll give it away here. We're looking at basically over 140-year-old bento box. So if any of you go to a Japanese restaurant for lunch, often your lunch is served in a beautifully lacquered box. This is a tradition that grew out of traveling meals in the 19th century. And this is something that was very much taken up. It started out as a tradition for farmers, but it was taken up by the nobility in Japan in the 19th century. And so what we're looking at here, this wonderful symbol that you see here, is actually what's called a mon. It's basically the Japanese equivalent of a heraldic symbol. It's identifying the noble family that this box actually belonged to. The way that this ties into my research is that I look at all of the different restoration and conservation campaigns that have been done to an object of art to understand its object biography. But also I've been doing a tremendous amount of study of 19th century Japanese alloys and the patinas applied to those alloys and how they were received in the West, because there's a tremendous flowering of patination, chemical patination in particular, that happens in the 19th century. A lot of that comes from the East, and it winds up even impacting the way that people in the 19th century perceived antiquities. And so there's a lot of fascinating alloys being used here, a lot of fascinating chemistry going on here. The black material that you're looking at is the Urushi Lacquer. Urushi Lacquer was used in China and Japan and Burma in order to make these beautifully shiny objects that whether you're talking about furniture or something like bento box, and was very desirable in the West. And so you actually see Japanese urushi panels like this being cut up from their original object and placed into French furniture with these elaborate French mounts. And the reason this was done by cabinet makers in France is that the urushi tree that this comes from is very closely related to poison ivy. And so to make a layer of urushi like this that's a few millimeters thick can take weeks or months of working with the urushi resin. And it's so toxic that even breathing it in can send you into anaphylactic shock. And so it's something that the Europeans preferred not to do themselves. Instead, they invented a technology called Japanning in order to do a reasonable substitute of this work, but they really wanted the original work from the East. And you can see some of the different metals that are present, as well as what's called the makie, the different metal flakes. And if that are suspended in the lacquer. If the lacquer is finely polished, then the metal flakes look like stars in the sky. They're so perfectly suspended in this black lacquer. And this is a look at the top-down view of the lid to give you a sense of some of the agents of degradation that are happening here, and to give you a sense of the treatment approaches and the analysis approaches that we would use to understand this object. And so one of the first things you can see in terms of the agents of degradation is mechanical degradation. We've got some scratches in the top of the box, and it's also lost its mirror-like sheen, and that's a result of its exposure to light. And so typically for high-style urushi objects like this, they come in a very beautifully finely made wooden box to protect them from the light. But this one has had quite a bit of light exposure. So I actually purchased this off of that famous antique dealer eBay, and this was really a conservator special in terms of something that I would be able to afford because it needed a lot of conservation work. And so what you see as brown now is actually the clay that was used before the gilding was applied. So the gold is missing here. The gold is all missing in the rim of the hat here that now looks brown. There's a little bit of it there. In terms of analysis approaches, we can use a technique called X-ray fluorescence to do elemental analysis to find out what all of these different gold and silver alloys are, because we know that pewter was used in this period and a Chinese alloy called pactong was used. And we could identify whether or not this was vermilion red or whether it was an iron oxide red. And then you get a sense of the massive amount of losses that have gone on to the lacquer layer. And this is because of something that we call in conservation science, the coefficient of thermal expansion. That basically the box is expanding, the box is made out of wood, I should say, and it's expanding and contracting with changes in relative humidity and changes in temperature. But the lacquer layer is not expanding and contracting as much. And so what happens is that the lacquer layers flake off. And you can see that there's a textile ground that's been applied to the wood. Then there would have been clay applied to the textile, and then the lacquer applied to that. In Japan, the way this is repaired is to basically fill in the missing lacquer with urushi to use the same material that was used originally. In the West, we never do that. We want all of the conservation treatments that are done to the object of art to be chemically distinct from the object itself so that they can be readily removed and identified. And so that's something to think about in terms of, we have some what I would call unsympathetic repairs to this work, such as this black paint here. But if this is evidence of the original Japanese use of the box and it contains urushi, we might want to leave it in place. And so there's a lot of this thinking about object biography and conservation ethics that go into play before we do treatment. And speaking of object biography, you can see that there have been holes drilled in the back of the lid so that it can actually be hung on a wall, sort of a Western use of this particular box. And so we can think about how the use of this object changed when it moved from Japan to the West. And then this is the underside of the interior box, and it shows the beautiful shine that would have been visible originally around the entire box. And you get the sense of the makie floating inside of the lacquer layer. Another look at some of the losses and attempted repairs that have gone on the exterior of the box. And then structural issues as well, and where you can see that the wood has started to break as well as the lacquer breaking. This is something that we probably would consider repairing. We would not remove the thread and the screws from the back of the lid, but this is something that could compromise the stability of the work going forward. I should also point out that something that we do in my field is we would rinse a box like this with a solvent like chloroform or methylene chloride in order to extract the food residues from the box, and then use a technique like gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, in order to find out the type of food that this box would have held in the Meiji or the Edo periods. And so we get to do some interesting molecular archaeology with these type of objects as well. And then another look where you can see that there's been some staining on the Urushi lacquer. Someone wiped this down and didn't completely remove some surface residues on it, and give you a sense not only of what a magnificent piece this was originally. All of these areas that look gray would have been a beautiful bright silver color, but then also how much integration to something to think about would be appropriate. When we have go back a couple slides here, something like this, this is evidence of use. And so that's also something you would want to think about in terms of, do you want to actually repair evidence of use, or do you want that to be part of the history of the object? And then when we look at the underside, you can see some of the massive losses to the piece that have occurred. So we don't have light exposure here. And so the Urushi lacquer is in great shape. But unfortunately, with those different coefficient of thermal expansion, we've lost a lot of the lacquer. And so interesting to think about all the different ways that you could approach this object depending upon what period you wanted to interpret. For example, if this was going in a historic house in Japan versus a historic house in the West. So I'll stop my share there, and I want to turn things over to my archaeologist colleague, Castor Mayer.
Okay, so here we are. I had a problem unmuting myself. So my name is Caspar Meyer, and I'm one of the two archaeologists at the Bard Graduate Center. My colleague Meredith Lynn is the historical archaeologist, and I'm what is known informally at BGC as the ancientist. So I'm mostly working on the first millennium BC, Greece and Rome, and I have a strong interest in Central Asia. I moved to the US about 3 years ago, so I'm fairly new to the Bard Graduate Center. Before that, I was teaching at the University of London for roughly a decade at Birkbeck College, which is one of the colleges of the University of London. I was trained, I think, all my previous career as an archaeologist of Greece in a rather narrow sense. But my dissertation work took me to what is normally known as the backwaters of the ancient world, the Black Sea region. And I was excavating for quite a few years with Russian teams in the Crimea. And I was particularly interested in the cultural relationships between Greeks and the nomads of the northern Black Sea region of the Eurasian steppe, and wrote my dissertation on this and published a book on metalwork in particular. Unfortunately, my excavation work has come to an end, partly because of the political situation in Crimea. But I'm working now on a new site in the Cyclades, so I'm returning to Greece itself, and a site, a sanctuary of the Archaic period, a sanctuary of Apollo. And you might ask yourself, hey, this man moved to the US fairly recently, but he finds himself in a room full of shelves with objects. And I can reveal to you now that I'm actually at the Bard Graduate Center. And I can show you briefly, this is our study collection. You see here, hopefully you can see this on the screen, rows and rows of shelves of our study objects. We don't acquire objects. These are all reached us through donations. So it's a very eclectic collection, but really we have something for every interest here. I think every colleague finds interesting case studies to research and to teach with. And that's what I want to do now. I'm actually going to focus on an object from our study collection. And I'm going to show it to you here now. I hope you can see it. I'm using here my phone to live stream images of this object. Can you see it? And I think I can actually start with I'm not going to ask you what it is. It's probably too peculiar at first sight, but I can tell you, I can build an interesting kind of contrast to what we've heard from my colleague Ivan Gaskell. This object has also to do with booze, but it's very, very different in terms of the story I can tell you about it, because it doesn't have that story that adheres to it. It was acquired on the art market in Italy and reached, as I said, the Bard Graduate Center through a donation from a private collector. And it was most likely excavated in a tomb. So it's a kind of museum object which we don't have a personal story that goes with it. And as an archaeologist, I have to focus on typology, on forms, and what is the object made of? How is it formed? And what can this tell us of the behaviors and norms and practices of those people who use those objects? It's a drinking cup, but it's a very peculiar one. We're actually very lucky to have this. I recently searched on a pottery database, which includes sort of a large majority of known pots from museums, and it came up with only 20 pieces. So it's a very interesting piece. It's worked in the so-called black figure technique, which means the figures themselves, I unfortunately have to show them to you upside down, I don't want to take this cup into my hands because I'm worried that I might drop it on camera, live streaming, but it's also in a bit of a fragile state. It underwent some conservation before it reached the market. And I think Jennifer Maas probably has looked at this before and can confirm that this is any archaeologist's horror. The fragments were just glued together, and that's why I don't want to handle this. I don't know how strong these joins have been fixed together. So it's black figure technique, which means the figures have been painted in slip. It was fired at relatively low temperature. So it's nothing, the kind of pottery that was later on, made later on for example, the Middle East, or also in China. It's the ceramic is not vitrified, and it remains a relatively porous vessel. So it's the inside is also painted to give it a bit of a watertight quality. And you can see here actually, if I look on, show you the top here, much of the painting was done by simply holding the brush onto the vessel surface and turning the vessel on the wheel. You can see here probably still the brush strokes and those two lines, the ground lines where this figure is standing on. It's an interesting combination of figures. Here you have a satyr, and he does what satyrs do. He holds a drinking vessel, and he's enjoying wine, alcohol, and he is sort of leaping forward. And to show you what he's doing, I show you the other side of the vessel where there's another figure, a lot more damaged. But a trained eye can tell you that the other figure must have been female. If you look at the face here, you see just a tiny little bit of white slip, which is in ancient, in iconography, a convention to show that the figure, the women, is a female figure. Actually, sorry, I'm just seeing in the chat here some comments. Are there problems with seeing? Oh, okay. You cannot actually see the vessel. I'm terribly sorry. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show it on the camera here. That's a lot easier. Can you all see it now? I think that's a safer option. So you have the satyr on the one side, painted in black figure, and then fine details incised. And that's the black figure technique. On the other side, you have the Maenad. It's a female figure, and they're both figures from the sort of retinue from the Thiasos of the god Dionysus. But I want to point out one really peculiar feature of that vessel, and that's the handles. You see, the vessel has two handles on the rim, and one of them to the left here is vertical, and the other one is horizontal. And they're also worked in a different way. One of them is round, and the other one is slightly kind of square. If you know Greek pottery shapes well, you can identify this with actually what are normally two completely different vessel types. On the one hand, you have a cantharos, which is a deep drinking vessel, and it so happens that it is what the satyr is holding in his hand. You can see that vessel too has vertical handles, and they're incised, and they have an edge. If you look at the, I have a picture of another vessel here, which is sort of the normal wine drinking cup. This is a kylix. And if you look at the handle, you can see it's the kind of handle which you have on the other side of that pot. Okay, why is this? Why do you have two different types handle on this drinking vessel. And this has a lot to do with the kinds of activities and ideologies that were at play in the Greek symposium. So this is the all-male drinking party, where men went to drink wine and discussed politics. It's often called the first political institution of ancient Greece. This is where allegiances were made and where political decisions in an informal way were decided on. But these symposia were also, of course, social events. And in order to show that you were a citizen who had the right upbringing and the right kind of abilities to make decisions in a political context, in a political assembly, you had to demonstrate that you were able to behave yourself the right way in a symposium. So that was the kind of question that you were encountering, that you were faced with when you went to someone else's symposium party. These are the kinds of questions which the material culture asked you at that moment. Were you going to be someone who is able to demonstrate their autonomy, their physical and ideological autonomy to make political decisions, or were you going to be someone who drinks too much so sort of indulges in bodily pleasures? And this is actually precisely what that vessel does. The calyx part, the calyx handle, is probably for gentlemanly kind of slow drinking. You've seen the calyx before with that kind of handle, which is the kind of vessel which makes you drink wine very, very slowly. You can only take small sips because it's a kind of vessel shape, almost like a plate of soup, which sort of demands that you take small sips. On the other hand, if you're looking at that deep cantharos here with the kind of handle you find here, it's a vessel that encourages you to drink, to take deep gulps of wine and drink quickly. So this is precisely what that kind of vessel, the kind of situation, the decision that it made you face. What kind of person are you going to be at that evening? Are you going to be someone who demonstrates the political acumen and the kind of social acumen of a freeborn citizen? Or are you going to be the kind of person who is almost like the satire on that shown on that piece, who is going overboard and is unable to withstand the temptations of physical pleasure? I think that's the kind of story that I can tell of this object. There is an object biography which has to do with the grave and the kinds of places where we find these objects nowadays, museums, sadly often without a clear context. But I think the object itself can reveal us just so much of what drinking wine in Greek antiquity was about, and that Greek consuming wine from specific types of vessel just had so much to do with the broader social context and the political context of being a freeborn citizen or being excluded from those privileges. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Itai Weinrib, who is probably going to take us forward in time a little bit to something more medieval. Hello, Itai.
You could unmute me, Dad.
Hello, I'm unmuted now, and I am the medievalist here at the Bard Graduate Center. I arrived in 2010, and I'm an art historian who wrote a book about bronze, and I'm currently writing a book about the Black Sea and Eurasia. So in that respect, I create a continuum between the work of Caspar Meyer, my colleague, and myself. I'm working on the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries in the Black Sea and Eurasia. In 2018, as part of what Dean Miller described as the exhibition side of this institution, I was fortunate to create an exhibition on votive given and votive objects. And since I am stranded in my apartment in New York, I couldn't find any too exciting objects to bring you except this very strange piece of square tin metal. We don't really know what the exact date of the material is, but it is kind of clear to us that it's kind of old. It has a certain rust to it. And from looking at other objects, such as square tin, such as these ones, we know that before they were made into just a flat square tin, they served to conserve fruits and vegetables, right, as a tin, right, which is a 19th century invention to preserve and conserve food products for a long period of time. Of course, that would be an extremely boring presentation if I'm just centering on a square tin that was once maybe a tin conserving vegetables or fruits. And so on the other side of this tin, there's obviously a painting, which is what we call a votive painting. This is a Mexican votive painting that was deposited in a small town, in a small church north of the town of Colina in Mexico, in Western Mexico. It is very interesting to see that this object has, of course, two key participants, or three key participants, if you will, right? There's a Virgin Mary floating in the clouds. There's an inscription beneath her, and then there's a man whose hand is wounded. And this is what we call a votive painting. It exists, I think, from antiquity. We can find many examples such as this one in Europe. And from the 16th century on, it arrives into the New World as part of missionary work by the Roman Catholic Church. The votive painting that I show you now, as you can see from the date below, is from 1944. And it has a very short inscription that says that the Virgin of Plantana, I'm sorry, I'm reading it from my own reflection on the screen. So the Virgin of the Virgin of Plantana was invoked by Salvador Ramirez in 1944 with the hope that his hand will be healed. And so the question is, of course, how these objects work. What is the relationship between the painted subject of the human and the painted Virgin in the clouds? Obviously, you can imagine that the Virgin in the clouds is not an image of the actual Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus Christ, but actually a painting of the sculpture, a painting of the cult image that is in the church of Plantana that presents the Virgin Mary. So we have here a painting of a sculpture that is floating in the clouds that represents a cult image in the small church in Plantana. We have a human being that chose to represent himself with his own wound and offer a small tin square image to the church. These type of images, as I said, exist all over the world. And if you go to the Church of Plantana, or if you go and Google, as we can do together, or you can do by yourself, the Church of Saint Mary, Saint Mary the Virgin in Plantana in Mexico, you will see that one of the images has a wall full of these objects. These objects were most likely offered together with a small donation, with the hope that such an image or such an object or such a ritual in which an object representing a human being will be offered to the gods, to the Virgin Mary, will bring healing and safe being to that exact human being, to that Salvador Ramirez. This leads me to a new project of research which I'm developing these days, which actually came about from being locked in a small apartment during COVID times. In March of last year, or all of the academic year last year, I was fortunate to be a member of a research institute in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. And sometime, well, I remember the date, March 16, a Friday, the gallery was shut down and we were forced to start staying at homes. I think we all remember that moment. It was not so long ago. And the only thing we had, the only opportunity we had is basically go outside, I think for an hour or two a day, and walk and look at nature, as much as nature that we have in the area. And I started taking a lot of photographs of flowers, and you can actually see them on my Instagram page. And they were all labeled as hope. And so with my pictures of flowers and thinking about hope and the world feeling that we need more hope, I started thinking about the idea of making things and hope. So artistic creativity and hope, or why does somebody like Salvador Ramirez sees hope in making such an object? How hope is a catalyst for creativity and for the production of material things. I still don't know, since it's the beginning of this project, I still don't know where the question of hope will take me to. It is a very old and very ancient question. I'm sure our colleague Casper knows many stories from antiquity and from mythology about hope and making. But hope, I feel, especially today in our daily lives, is something that really drives us forward. And I think that it would be interesting as part of this, let's say, new projects that develop from an old exhibition to start thinking about hope in relation to someone like Salvador Ramirez, hope in relations to ourselves, and hope in relation to making of things and creativity. And this is maybe the interesting thing about exhibition projects at the Bard Graduate Center. In a way, they never end. The exhibition closes, the gallery shut down the light, trucks come and pick up the objects and bring them back to their respected collections. But in a way, the research project that is around, that surrounds the exhibition making continues. I think anyone who curated an exhibition at the Bard Graduate Center from the faculty continues to develop and enhance their old project and finds new ways to bringing them back in this way or the other, either scholarly work or who knows, as another exhibition, as a second exhibition or a digital project or something as such. So yeah, this is the squarish old tin metal square that I brought with us that can actually represent a sign of hope and faith. So thank you. And I think this is the moment to introduce again Keith Condon, right? As I am Mr. Weinrib, that is to say the last speaker of the faculty, because my name begins with a W. Oh, Peter, sorry. Oh, Casper. No, who's speaking now, guys? I think it's Keith's turn.
We're gonna transition now to questions. I think hope was a very good way to a good theme on which to end. I was wondering, we had a surfeit of drinking, and we had, even if we include the lacquer as a tray on which to perhaps have the drinking vessel. I was afraid when Itai, when you showed us just the back of the square, I thought another drinking utensil, but you pulled it back and left us in a good place. So I think we'll now open the floor to some questions. And I think you can either wave at me or chat at me, and I will try and find you. So I see Suzette.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed every moment of it, and I've learned quite a lot, too. My question is that I live in Hawaii. I teach at the University of Hawaii art history, actually. And I wondered, is it possible to do your program from afar? I know now with COVID, everything is virtual, and, Zoom has given, us a wonderful tool. It's what I use with my own students. But being that, your program is object-based, obviously you need to see the objects. I'm just wondering, what are the possibilities if I were to want to do this remotely? Is it even a possibility?
So I'm afraid the answer is, as you expect, no. We're very committed to in-person teaching, as you yourself pointed out. There's something especially painful about having to talk about objects in this kind of a way. I do think that when the tide of COVID recedes, there is an element of the Zoom world which we do recognize to be incredibly valuable. It is a chance to have a conversation with people who cannot, for any number of reasons, be physically present in New York. It's for sure the case that in our research and teaching, we will, after all of this is over, do more events with people who are elsewhere by Zoom, that we will have more teaching from colleagues who are at other institutions in other cities. That's for sure will happen. I don't think we're yet at the stage of developing a degree program for people who are not in New York. I'm not saying it won't happen. I do think that before we can get there, the problem that you posed is one that we will have to solve.
Yeah, I completely understand. Yeah.
But I will say, and in a way tonight is an example, and we also have another project where we work with students at LaGuardia Community College and have developed in collaboration with faculty there, object-based learning, where the students use objects from their own families or from the world in which they live. And we build the teaching and actually an online exhibition, which you can see on our website, around those personal objects like the ones my colleagues brought tonight. So it's not that it's impossible to do object-based teaching, because the principles are the same. The content of the stories and the technique and the materials, of course, changes dramatically. And that's, since we care about all those things, those are not insignificant facts. So in the future, maybe, but next year, no. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Thank you.
Sure. Other questions? I have a question from Kimberly Miller that popped up in my chat. If one is interested in the PhD program, should a dissertation topic be more or less worked out prior to applying? The answer is no. As somebody who went to graduate school knowing exactly what I wanted, and 7 months later was crying on the floor because my topic was a failure, I know full well that that's not really the best way to go. You can have an interest, a direction, and follow it. But I can say, not just from my own experience, that you at the Bard Graduate Center as a PhD student will, in the first year or two that you're here, learn so much, not just in class, but in the hallways talking to your classmates, at night talking to your friends, listening to speakers in our seminar series, that you will quickly develop, if not a totally different project, that doesn't always happen, but a much more sophisticated take on what it is you thought you were doing. So no, we don't at all insist upon it. And I would say to PhD students, but also to MA students, because some of the same logic applies. And that is, as you heard already tonight, we are a small institution with a very varied and broad intellectual profile. And we really encourage our students to sample widely, because the particular way we do business, so to speak, is one that you will not have found before you came to us, and it'll have an effect on how you think. And so to give yourself over to that opportunity is something we think very valuable. I have another question popped up from Mariela Aguero Barantes. Do you need to pick advisors at a PhD level in the first year? No. So all PhD students who are accepted for their first year are watched over by our director of doctoral studies, who takes all of them under his or her wing and makes sure that their introduction and orientation goes off without a hitch, keeps them apprised as to all of the bureaucratic requirements, the student regulations. And as you develop your intellectual interests and the focus at the institution, you will move at the next stage to field exams and choosing those. And by then you may have a very strong idea about who it is you want to work with. And then it's the proposal stage. By the time you're writing a proposal, you have an advisor. So you may have something in mind at the start. You may get there over the course of the first year. You'll certainly get there over the course of your second year. Other questions? The chat is a good technique. I have it open, there it is. Thank you very much. So Josh Massey, if you enter as an MA student, how many transition to the PhD program? So it varies from year to year. Some years, none. And then some years we have 3 or 4 of our MA students who apply. So at the moment, I would say, and this is something that Keith can talk to you about more precisely if you have an interest in this, we do think that the MA course at the BGC is the best preparation for PhD. And as a result, it's a faster track in the PhD program if you come with an MA from the BGC. It does cut down the time by about a year. So that is advantageous. At the moment, it's hard to say in terms of next year what the numbers will be, but there are always, almost always, students from the MA program who apply to the PhD. Another question from Alicia Parker about inclusiveness and how we will continue to push that initiative forward during these times. I'm very glad you brought that up. It's something that's really been in the forefront of our attention this year. I could say a lot about it. I have already put a lot in writing, as you mentioned in your chat online. So to give you an example of how the institution has reacted not only to the Black Lives Matter and the crisis, one of the crises of our times, but also as a reflection of the character of the institution and in particular the faculty. So meeting amidst the crisis in July and wanting very much to make the institution more open to something which we hadn't really paid enough attention to, and that's through no fault necessarily of our own. The world that we study is a very vast one, and we feel always that there are parts of the world and subject areas that we wish we could teach, but simply because we only have the faculty members that we haven't been able to devote attention to them. But thinking about the crisis of our times, the faculty itself, from, as it were, below, not from any mandate from the director or myself, came up with the idea, pardon me, of putting together a course devoted to the subject of unsettling the canon, to take the various disciplines that we represent and many of the sub-narratives and bibliographies, which handed down from generation to generation constitute what we call discipline, and to show the way they are constructed, functions of time and place, of politics, of exclusions, because every inclusion is also an exclusion. And so to take what is excluded and to use it as a lens through which to show the possibilities for new kinds of scholarship in the future that will not only allow for new kinds of stories, but also encourage new voices and new people to enter the scholarly world. And that's something that the faculty created on their own and have been developing. It's going to roll out in the spring. Students are already enrolled in that course. They're registered. The course closed, it hit its maximum. I should say that the courses at the BGC cap out at 10. All the seminars are small. We sit around a table when we can be in a room together, and I hope that we can do that again soon. So that course was immediately oversubscribed. And we're thinking actually of integrating that course into the required approaches to the object and extending it from being a 1-semester course to a 2-semester course, because we think that this kind of reorientation of perspective, which has so many important social consequences and benefits in our time now, is also just as much of value for intellectual reasons in terms of the constant broadening of perspectives that we at the BGC are fully committed to. So thank you. Continuing education courses offered by the school. We don't have a formal continuing education program. We offer many kinds of lectures, obviously associated with the Research Institute, and also through our very active public programs department, which not only helps support exhibitions in the gallery, but also really deals with the kinds of subjects and subject matter that is on our spectrum and part of our focus, but falls between, let's say, the exhibition program and the degree programs in the classroom.